is Victoria Wojcicka, and I represent International Center for Ukrainian Victory. And it's a pleasure and great honor to be here at this great event together with our distinguished panelists. And this panel is going to be dedicated to a very important issue related to energy safety and security, with specific targeting and focus on nuclear safety and security. We have absolutely amazing panel today, representatives of different countries with absolutely astonishing background. And I would like to first start with opening remarks of each and every member of our distinguished panel to give their brief overview of the issues related to energy safety and security and in nuclear safety and security, especially in light of the developments, dire developments that are happening in Ukraine with respect to Russian nuclear terrorism that's been taking place from the start of the full-scale invasion. So I would like to give a floor first to Olga Babiy. She represents Ukrainian energy regulator. And the floor is yours, Olga. Please give your thoughts, share your thoughts with us with respect to where we are right now with respect to nuclear safety and security.
Вітаю всіх. Рада бачити сьогодні всіх на нашому
Warmest greetings to everybody. I will happy to welcome our distinguished guests at our event. Please make sure that you have your headsets ready for translation from Ukrainian into English, because today we are discussing a very complex, comprehensive, and sometimes complicated with difficulties and challenges subject of peaceful nuclear energy, which in the context of the war, full-scale war taking place in Ukraine, has become a nuclear weapon. Today, we have to understand and we have to deliver this clear message to each and every country, emphasizing that Russia has seized in the Ukrainian territory nuclear fuel, and this is the language we have to use. Russia has seized nuclear fuel, and via such seizure of nuclear fuel, thus committing a terrorist attack, Russia is threatening the rest of the civilized world. Moreover, it starts a pattern of converting nuclear power plants into nuclear bombs. As we analyze the political context, trying to understand what happened and why, and what do we have to do in order to prevent this from happening tomorrow, we come to a very important observation, which is that an organization which should be monitoring distribution, circulation, and use of nuclear fuel, and that is International Atomic Energy Agency, under such circumstances should have deployed all elements and tools of international law to stop such process. But this didn't happen. Why is the question? Trying to explain that question, we have to appreciate that at the level of IAEA, there are no protocols, regulations, and guidelines which would recognize such facts and respective course of actions and instructions for responding to such incidents. At this moment, we can see that we, as Ukraine, speaking to United Nations Organization and other international platforms, we have to deliver a very clear message that when speaking of the international law, applying this vision to the situation in Ukraine, we have to change the rules of safety and security for the future. What do we have to do? First of all, we have to apply changes at the international level under the auspices of International Atomic Energy Agency to develop the clear guidelines and regulations for managing nuclear fuel in case of seizure by any terrorist organization, just like it happened in Ukraine. There should be clear tools, regulations, and guidelines which will recognize such acts as violation of international safety and security fundamentals, Similar to that, the same reasoning should be applied to destruction of infrastructure or seizure of nuclear fuel storages or disposal sites, like this happened in Chernobyl exclusion zone, because this is posing direct threat to major incidents of global scale. When we talk to our partners, presenting this vision and interpretation of the situation and suggesting that the peaceful time regulations do not apply in the wartime and settings, and again, this was unprecedented, but this happened. Once such precedent has been committed, we have to understand that the rules have to be changed and the terrorists should be brought to justice. Because what we see is indeed seizure of the disposal sites, demolition of Kakhovka dam, which was directly related to functionality of Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant, seizure of the Zaporizhzhya NPP, with the zero response from the international organizations, which is a very clear message broadcasted to other terrorist organizations having the green light to proceed with similar actions somewhere in France, in UK, in the USA, or somewhere in Turkey, in Egypt, in India. And nobody will be persecuted for doing so, because in the context of international law, IAEA will claim we don't have guidelines, we don't have clear tools and protocols to regulate such instance. So this would be the external contour of the subject under discussion. The second contour being that we have to strengthen the sanction policy as applicable to the countries which commit such crimes. So there should be clear sanctions against Russia when it comes to managing the nuclear waste, nuclear fuel, and nuclear sites. If it's impossible to do today, then we should have, say, guidelines for tomorrow, because Rosatom is a very powerful agent in the global nuclear scene. And from a couple of years from today, there should be an opportunity for other countries to diversify their supply links to be independent from Russian nuclear fuel supplies. And Russia has to clearly understand that soon enough, the latest 5 years from today, it will be fully isolated from any supply chain taking in the technology, supplies and consumables to develop their nuclear network. As you visit the Rosatom website and look at the number of sites they are developing in different countries of the world, I am scared. I'm scared as a mother, because Russia been stipulated by lack of responsibility and persecution for committing their crimes, but having access to all of the R&D documentation of all of those nuclear power plants in other countries of the world, they can easily share such files with any terrorist group, any agency or service which might have powers to access and seize such sites, then using or rather abusing access to such information. They'll be also available to turn this peaceful energy site into a warful atomic energy site. And we all together, starting from India through Turkey to Ukraine and other countries of the world, we have to join our efforts in preventing Russia from doing so. So, thus setting the stage for our discussion, please be invited.
Started already covering the issue of Rosatom. With your permission, our distinguished guest, I would like to give a floor to Oksana Ishchuk, Executive Director, Center for Global Studies Strategy 21st, and discuss the issue related to sanctions on Rosatom. Actually, the absence of sanctions on Rosatom. Absolutely extraordinary situation where we're dealing with the nuclear terrorism for the first time in the history of humankind, and we don't see any reaction whatsoever from no one. I mean, no one, neither from our partners and allies, nor from other countries as well. So could you please share your thoughts when it comes to Rosatom and the way the state, the terrorist state, and its organization, Rosatom, should be punished for the nuclear terrorism?
Thanks a lot for inviting me. What we have for now, Europe is highly dependent on Russian fuel, as well as America. There are a lot of nuclear power plants, which is in Europe functioning on Russian fuel. 18 Russian-designed nuclear reactors in Slovakia, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czech Republic, and in Finland that currently run exclusively on Rosatom fuel. Now they are highly dependent on it. It is necessary to reduce this cash flow, and this helps to fuel not only these nuclear units, but to fuel the war in Ukraine, to fuel this cruel aggression in Ukraine, because this makes the coffers of Russian Federation empty of money flows. So the trade with these uranium enrichment services should be stopped. And example adequate reaction of this is the stopped joint venture in Finland on the nuclear power plant of Hanhikivi 1. And another adequate reaction was the stop of power unit construction in Czech Republic, Dukovany. So this is the adequate examples of how to stop cooperate with Russia. We know that Hungary, with Orban regime, blocks all the sanction packages concerning nuclear. And now the 12th package is on the path to be adopted. So we must act in the way that nuclear sanctions be involved in this package. And in view of this, it is considered appropriate and necessary to make following steps. First one, the initiative of Ukraine and the group of EU member states to freeze all existing projects with the participation of Rosatom or its affiliated companies or joint ventures until the complete cessation of Russian aggression and the withdrawal of occupation troops of Russian Federation. Second proposed step is it is necessary to demand from the French government the termination of the number of projects and agreement with Rosatom. The first one is the termination of strategic cooperation agreement dated December 2, 2021 between the French nuclear Framatome and Rosatom. Second, termination of cooperation between subsidiary Rosenergoatom and the French Électricité de France. Another step should be adopted. It is a categorical demand to both the French government and European Commission and the United States regarding the termination of the agreement in early February 2022 for the acquisition by Rosatom with the assistance of the EDF of 20% of the French turbine manufacturing GIST. It is a joint venture between American General Electric and the French Alstom. So Rosatom will not be able to implement its foreign projects without Ukrainian Turboatom and without American-French GIST turbines. Another step, it's demand to stop cooperation in the production in partnership with Areva, now Orano, of heat-releasing assemblies at Elektrostal near Moscow for 7 nuclear power units in Europe. Alstom's withdrawal from the Alstom Atomenergomash joint venture created in 2007. Another step, Russia should be excluded from the international projects to build the ITER thermonuclear fusion reactor in France on the Cadarache plateau. Third, the government of Ukraine should appeal to the European Commission and the governments of the EU member states regarding the transfer of power units with Soviet-designed reactors to non-Russian fuel. We should understand that only 18 of 103 nuclear units in the EU depend on Russian fuel. And they produce no more than 10% of nuclear energy in the European Union. So this could be done. Second, appeal to USA and Canada regarding the review of the approach to the license previously granted by the government bodies in the USA and Canada to the daughters and granddaughters of the Rosatom, in particular Tenex and Uranium-1. The latter conduct extensive activities with sale and extraction of uranium raw materials. Also, Russia is occupying some uranium-containing raw materials facilities in Kazakhstan, which is world leader of this, and Uzbekistan. Thus, Rosatom controls 36% of the global market. In the US alone, acting through subsidiaries, it has 25 contracts for supply of uranium raw materials with 19 American firms until 2028, and this contract is worth more than $6 billion. A direct ban on the import of uranium in the USA firm Rosatom structures should be logical and without any particular consequences, because concerning some of projections, it will cost only 3% of electricity increasing, price of electricity increasing in US. So all these steps should be done, and it could be done. And of course, one of speakers said that the sanctions should be included in 12th package. And of course, we could say that, of course, it is not very simple to get rid of uranium production facilities of fuel of Russia, as it was with oil and gas, because in case of oil and gas, it was only to change supplier. But in case of Russian fuel, we must rebuild all the supply chain from uranium production to uranium enrichment. But it should be done now, and we can highlight that the gradual ban should be imposed in 3 or 5 years to give possibilities to companies to diversify. So we should do these steps to stop this cruel war in Europe and to not make Russia using civil atom as a weapon in 21st century. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it's a very important subject. We've seen steps made by our partners with respect to oil and gas, cutting the supply from Russia and dependence from Russian oil and gas. However, when it comes to nuclear, we haven't seen such a dramatic steps taken, and understanding that it's important to become completely independent from authoritarian regime that conducts acts of nuclear terrorism. It's just, for me, completely, I cannot even comprehend how Western world and our partners can continue cooperating with a country that conducts such unprecedented acts of nuclear terrorism. And indeed, all of those steps that Oksana mentioned, they have to be taken into consideration very seriously, and not just by Ukraine, but all over the world, to make all of us less dependable, or actually completely independent from the aggressor. At this point, I would like to give a floor to Dr. Kasapoglu, Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute, Director of Defense Research. And I would like you to make your opening remarks and share with us your thoughts on this subject that we're discussing.
Sure. Thank you, ma'am. Distinguished participants, great to be in Ukraine. Let's have a time machine. And let's have a time machine and let's go, say, January 2022. By the beginning of that year, seeing what we call in intelligence analysis the telltale indicators, we anticipated that there was going to be a Russian invasion, and that invasion was going to be a full-scale invasion. And most probably at a time when, you know, the mainstream Western think tanks were anticipating a collapse, a sudden collapse of the Ukrainian military, we were on the opposing side, we were expecting a long war, and we were expecting a resilient defensive combat operations by the Ukrainian military. But at the time, let's have this meeting before the war and before the invasion. Let's have this meeting in a round table in a Washington, D.C. think tank. And if I tell you in a hypothetical scenario that the Ukrainian coastal defenses will sink Moscow missile cruiser, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, Ukrainian loitering munitions, which is the kamikaze drones, the cool name for that, would penetrate into the Engel space, hosting strategic bomber aircraft. Ukrainian helicopters, rotary wing assets will penetrate in Belgorod, okay? And the Ukrainian military will start a counter-offensive, repelling the Russians to the other bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson. The main idea with all the seconds of these anticipations would be the Russian tactical nuclear weapons use. Definitely. Because look at the doctrine of the Russian Federation as to the nuclear weapons use. Look at all Zapad drills, starting from 2009. All Zapad drills included a nuclear warfare scenario, okay? And the Russians deployed dual-use systems along the Ukrainian frontier, like the SS-26 Iskander ballistic missiles, and we could just see them like the palm of our hands with open-source satellite intelligence, okay? But the tactical nuclear weapons used right now is something that you see on Dmitry Medvedev's Twitter account and nothing else, weekly. Your weekly reminder by Dmitry Medvedev that the Russians will soon use tactical nuclear weapons. It was impossible. It was impossible, why? Because the contact line was a few hundred meters, we saw in Irpin. The Russians did not have the capability to deploy CBRN troops, chemical, radiological, biological, and nuclear protection troops to run such operations. The only thing they could do was a demonstrative strike in the Black Sea. And Black Sea, we have 3 NATO nations, and one of them happens to have the strongest navy in the Black Sea, so I wouldn't definitely recommend doing that, okay? But there was another threat, the radiological threat. And the radiological threat was there, and we missed that because we were so focused on the prospects of tactical nuclear weapons use by the Russian military. Now, that real threat, we can name it, you know, in the civilian realm that I'm hearing here. And I understand the psychology, of course, being in a war against the Russian Federation and defending a homeland. Barbaric, you know, horrific, terrible. In my dark world of military science and military affairs, these things do not exist. We have a strong objectivity, and I can assure you the strong objectivity is even more horrifying than all these words. Why? So far, we have seen the one and first attempt, and then the execution of it, that a kinetic strike on a nuclear power plant in an ongoing war. There were incidents before, during the Iran-Iraq war, for instance, Bushehr, but Bushehr had no fuel, no nuclear fuel. The Israelis, back in 2008, when they were running that surgical operation against Deir Zor El-Kibar in Syria, they dispatched special forces teams to the ground, and they made sure that the nuclear facility was not active at the time. So dispatching special forces teams to the Ba'ath regime-ruled Syria amidst the Mukhabarat and the Syrian Arab army away from the Israeli Defense Forces territory, that was the care that the Israeli Defense Forces showed before a punitive operation, like deploying Israeli special forces on a hostile nation on the Syrian soil. For the first time, we have seen that the Russians went with kinetic strikes against nuclear power plants. But there is more. Again, like, as I said, in my dark world, there is not these words, but the pure scientific military objectivity, and this is more horrifying. This was incorporated in the battle plan since the very outset, because in the overture of the conflict, in the opening stages of the conflict, we saw that the Russian military suddenly, in a blitz fashion, they took control of Chernobyl. Well, Chernobyl was not active, but this was a critical facility, and we know that the International Atomic Energy Agency lost connection and the monitoring with that. Then immediately after Zaporizhzhya, so we understand that this was the battle plan since the outset. Boiling it down to the what we call rules of engagement. Rules of engagement is how you employ your combat formations on the battleground. Shelling of a nuclear power plant, that wasn't some rogue Russian commander. That wasn't some rogue, out of control Russian unit. It was specific because we know that by open source intelligence, the Ukrainians painted the area by projectors. And they said, look, there is the nuclear power plant. You're going to fight and you're going to invade, but keep out fighting from this area. The Russian units' rules of engagement did not incorporate no firing, no shelling, no artillery fire in the Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant. That was unimaginable because that was setting a history in a notorious fashion. And third, the thing is, and I'm going to end here the first round to keep the timing, even when you dispatch your military in a full-scale invasion and you give such a crazy order that you can engage in firefight in a high-risk operational, underlining that this was not Chernobyl. It was an operational NPP. It was the largest, if I'm not mistaken, both in Ukraine and in Europe. They did not dispatch any accompanying CBRN teams that, if, excusing my French, shit hits the fan, to contain the situation. There was only combat formations, no CBRN teams accompanying that. You could not even imagine something like that at NATO standards. No NATO military would go into a nuclear power plant without organic CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear defense troops without doing that. Okay? So you are not on the real dangerous. You know, you can face the barbarians, you can face whatever you call like that. In my world, I do not use them. But when you are facing an unprofessional military with bad planning, bad execution, and amateurish understanding of warfare, this is more dangerous than barbarism. Because military science and military affairs are so sensitive. Okay? So this is from me in the first round. Thank you so much. And I thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you very much. You've painted really very interesting picture from the military perspective. And I think we will have more time to discuss it in more details. Right now we have Oliver Della Costa Stunkel, professor at the School of International Relations from São Paulo, Brazil, online. So, colleagues, can you please put our distinguished guest on the screen so we can hear his views and his points on the subject?
Thank you very much, Tora. It's a pleasure to be part of this very important discussion. Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to make a number of brief initial remarks complementing what my other colleagues on the panel have already pointed out. The first issue I'd like to say before coming to energy security, of course, is that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has led to a broad reconsideration of many basic assumptions about global order and of interconnectedness, of the way we can rely on interconnectedness in a globalized world to achieve prosperity, the hopes that multipolarity would not necessarily be more violent and unpredictable. But in many ways, this conflict, I think, is forcing countries around the world, including in the global south and in Brazil, to reassess how to engage. And I think many of these things take some time, particularly if we speak about energy security. These aren't issues that countries can change overnight. So I think that we will see over the course of the coming years, countries reduce their exposure. They will seek to depend less on specific actors such as Russia for their energy security. However, particularly in the global south, of course, energy security is intimately tied to issues around social stability, for example, and the energy vulnerability in the global south is, of course, significant. And the invasion that took place last year has produced significant volatility of energy prices, which for many countries, many developing countries, has been quite devastating, particularly considering that regions like Latin America had an extremely difficult decade prior to the COVID pandemic. Basically in Brazil, for example, we had near 0% economic growth, still dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic, high interest rates. And now the high volatility of energy prices has obviously made the prospect of returning to higher growth more difficult. And I think we see that when you look at continued political instability in the region, and I think certainly the ripple waves that have been caused by Russia's invasion are part of that picture. So I think that the diversification strategies, when we look at particularly the global south, but also Europe, will not be necessarily visible in the short term, because several of them, of course, depend on long-term contracts. Actually, some countries in the global south, while denouncing at multilateral fora Russia's aggression, have actually increased the purchase of Russian oil, and Brazil is actually one of these countries, which one could describe as sort of realpolitik, and using that as an opportunity to pay less for fuel. We've also seen it in several other countries in the global south. But at the same time, I think we see a growing number of experts point to the necessity to accelerate the energy transition and reduce the exposure of the of importing oil from actors such as Russia, and I think Latin America in that context will certainly play an important role, being a home to a high number of rare earths, lithium, and other elements crucial for the green energy transition, and which is, of course, a crucial step towards reducing the dependence or increasing the capacity to protect itself from the volatility of energy prices. Now, regarding nuclear energy security, as several of the other people on the panel have pointed out, Russia has, of course, continued to export significant amounts of nuclear technology and supplies since its invasion of Ukraine, including to members of the EU and NATO. That has also limited the capacity of European countries to put pressure on countries in the global south to wean themselves off their dependence on Russian energy. It is, of course, as we all know, in particular France, for example, still imported almost 400 million worth of enriched uranium from Russia last year. There is, of course, initial movements to address that economic vulnerability, both in the United States and in Europe. There is a number of steps that are being taken. The United States and Canada have pledged to rebuild capacity to enrich uranium. There is efforts to develop shared supply chains to isolate Russia. Sweden refused to purchase Russian nuclear fuel. Finland is another example. But I think that we will begin to see the results of that throughout the coming years because it is so difficult to make short-term changes. And some countries actually have been restrained in their capacity to take a clear stance, diplomatic stance, on the Russian invasion, in part because they are home to Russian reactors that are being built, particularly countries like Bangladesh and Egypt, for example, in that sense, are dependent on Russia in a way that perhaps ties their hands to some extent as they're addressing this this crisis. So this is, I think, the overall situation, which I think explains to some extent why some countries have not been able to immediately take, I think, more direct steps. I think the global economy is still in an extremely fragile state, particularly across the global south, where there's a lot of understanding of the negative economic impacts on energy security and on the overall economic situation at the same time. Because of a highly integrated global economy and Russia's status as a key provider of energy, these are steps that in many cases I think will take several years until they can rearrange their energy supply chains and reduce their exposure. I will stop here and one more time, thank you very much for having the opportunity to join this panel.
Thank you very much for your remarks. Really amazing to hear all of your insights. Thank you. And I would like to give a floor to Ruhinyok and to sum up the first round of our discussions of what we have touched upon, especially in light, I think it's important to look at the issues related to de-risking, decoupling from Russia as a source of energy. From a perspective of countries like India, we've seen quite a reverse trend where the import of the Russian oil has dramatically increased, not decreased, where there is still quite strong cooperation with respect to nuclear assets and nuclear projects that are being developed. So could you please give us your perspective on that, and what would you suggest to do in this regard?
Thank you, Victoria.
Sorry, Director of the Institute of Peace on Conflict Studies. Yeah, I haven't introduced you fully.
Absolutely fine. My extensive biography is in the pages of that document. Very interesting to hear the remarks that were presented today. I do want to clarify that I am not an energy expert. I work specifically on nuclear issues. And what I'd like to do today, as I also discussed with Victoria previously, is come at this from the perspective of nuclear security, very specifically. So we do know that nuclear security, and we have seen this play out in the war, you know, it is, while it is a very particular area of study, it is intrinsically linked to food security. It is intrinsically linked to energy security, to international security, which is a term that you used again earlier in our conversation today. So in the context of my remarks, what I'd like to focus on a little bit, picking up right actually from the first presentation or the first set of remarks that were made today, is to look at the protection of nuclear facilities during war. And in this regard, I think it will be useful to go over some of the challenges that I think we are facing now, given new and emerging nuclear security risks, particularly in the ways that we are trying to adapt old solutions to addressing these risks. And I will also try to identify a couple of ways forward for our discussion. Now, you know, when we are talking about the strengthening of nuclear security, which is really one of the fundamental objectives I would imagine of this panel, we are really talking about, and this again was referred to in various different ways by the speakers today, we're talking about behavioral change. Have heard a set of policy recommendations. We have heard a set of behavioral changes and normative changes that need to be made in the international system. Now, in regard to this, one thing I will flag is that for this kind of behavioral change to occur, we have to first generate the conditions that make conversations about this kind of behavioral change more feasible. And I don't think that the landscape in terms of these conversations, as you pointed out, Victoria, look the same currently in different parts of the world. So to change this environment then, to create the conditions necessary to generate greater options than those that exist currently, one of the things that we should be looking at, and this is a more conceptual sort of discussion, is clarifying and expanding the scope of language and definitions within nuclear security. Now, the term nuclear security itself has been extensively misinterpreted. It has been extensively misappropriated, and this has happened also by experts such as myself who operate within this field. So to expect that lay folk will apply themselves to understanding the technical definition, I think also policymakers, would be a bit of a stretch. This is important because so far we see instances of nuclear security being used as a catch-all term to describe everything from nuclear deterrence to nuclear postures to, nuclear materials security. So all of it sort of is used within the rubric of nuclear security. But really, its technical definition means preventing nuclear materials from, and nuclear installations and infrastructure from falling into malicious hands. Now, in this shorthand, when we use the term nuclear security to mean a whole host of things outside of the scope of its definition, what we do is that we distort its technical meaning, and therefore we distort how we understand the issue. And that actually has a very serious knockdown impact then on how politicians, who typically tend to be generalists, perceive the issue of nuclear security, and also how global conversations and discourses around nuclear security are constructed. Now, another element of this conceptual issue of language and definitions, and I heard the term nuclear terrorism, right, come up several times. This is with regard to, the term nuclear security itself. Now, since 9/11, the nuclear security field has focused almost exclusively on non-state actors. So militant actors, terrorist actors, however you choose to label them. And this was solidified, in fact, by the Nuclear Security Summit process that was initiated by President Obama in 2010, and that concluded in 2016, that focused on nuclear terrorism and nuclear terrorism committed by non-state actors. So really at this time, we don't have any globally accepted terminology to refer to or to denote a state that commits hostilities against nuclear facilities, or a scenario in which you have a state that effectively commandeers a nuclear facility, as we've seen play out in this war, and then weaponizes that facility for the purposes of war. So there is at this time absolutely no terminology that is widely accepted. So to, nuclear terrorism committed by a state is, we can use it colloquially, but it wouldn't fly in more policy official circles. Now, this brings me to a linked point, which is that of desiloization. Now, desiloization conceptually is very often invoked in all professional fields because it is of critical relevance to all professional fields. But what we don't do is break desiloization down and try to understand what it means in all of these different professional contexts. And it is extremely important for the field of nuclear security because, as we know, it is inhabited by very disparate stakeholder groups. So you have engineers, you have scientists, you have scholars, you have security practitioners, politicians, all sort of operating at different levels of expertise, and they bring this expertise to bear on addressing nuclear security risks. Now, what they don't do very often, these communities of expertise, is interact with one another to have this sort of knowledge exchange and understanding that goes beyond their narrow areas of expertise. And I think this is certainly something that needs rectifying, and now would probably be the right time to take that conversation forward. Now, another point that de-siloization is linked to is knowledge production, right? Who produces knowledge? Who is it produced for? And who consumes this knowledge? In my own observations, I have found that, and this is pertinent because we are at a Global South conference, is there are perhaps not so obvious hierarchies that exist within academic and policy circles, right? So we actually tend to look at a very small set of actors who we think present behavior that could be replicated and from whom lessons could be derived. So this seems a bit ironic to me because we continue, all of us, we continue to emphasize the relevance and importance of the Global South. But really what we do is we look at the Global North to derive these lessons from. So often, you know, I am a bit critical, perhaps a bit disappointed, not here, in general, in terms of emphasis on the Global South, that this is really merely rhetorical emphasis if we can't understand the way in which knowledge production and exchange of ideas between equals can operate and what the current reality looks like. And I bring up the point of knowledge production because, of course, here you want to diversify the actors that you learn from and also exchange information and ideas with. And in this regard, you know, India and Pakistan have had in place since 1990 an agreement that commits each other to not attack each other's nuclear facilities and installations. And it has held since 1990. And this agreement actually follows an Indian military exercise, what was essentially a war game called Operation Brass Tacks a few years prior. And what Indian and Pakistani politicians then recognized was the dangers of misperception, right? Because Pakistan interpreted this war game as deliberate military movement, which it wasn't. And they then agreed to sort of enter this agreement and committed to not targeting each other's facilities. They were cognizant of the fact of the costs of misperception, as I said, and they also recognized the catastrophically negative fallout, you know, should any of these actors, or either of these actors rather, should attend to a consideration of targeting nuclear facilities during a crisis. So every year, in fact, whether India and Pakistan have official bilateral dialogue, whether they're engaged in talks, whether they are in the midst of a crisis, this list of coordinates of installations is exchanged faithfully at the beginning of every year, and it has happened since 1990. Now, to my surprise, because you know, I speak on some of these subjects at different venues across the world, and what stunned me a bit was that practically no one knew about the existence of this instrument. Why is that the case, right? Because I think what we tend to do is adopt very particular lenses when it comes to looking at different regions across the world. And again, very important conversation for a conference on the Global South. And the automatic lens that is adopted when it comes to South Asia or Southern Asia, I'm including China here, I will say that many people in our own region are guilty of this negative bias. And I'm borrowing the words of a former American politician, it is that of the most dangerous place, right? And what this perception does then is it politicizes what could be frank and genuine intellectual engagement. What it does to policy making is it precludes absolutely any consideration of the possibility of learning from two nuclear-armed neighbors who may have evolved their own indigenous kind of nuclear learning. Now, this brings me then to my final point, and I think this ties in nicely with several of the recommendations that have been made, which is none of this will come to pass if there is an absence of political will. So creating political will then is a question of process, and here I'll focus very specifically and narrowly on nuclear security. I referred to the nuclear security summit process 2010 to 2016 under Obama. I think it's worth asking why this process was as successful as it was in that period of time, and what is it from that process that can be borrowed for now. So one, the Nuclear Security Summit process democratized access. There are countries across the world that have fundamental differences of opinion with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the nuclear regime, although majority of them continue to adhere to its norms. And two, very importantly, is that there was very high political visibility attached to the nuclear security summits, and this created critical incentivization for states to not only participate, but to voluntarily offer up national nuclear security commitments, which was astounding. So the question we should be asking then is, what is it about this period of time and this highly successful summit process that took place that we can adapt to now and sort of bring nuclear security back on the agenda? To wrap up, I'm always aware of this, and I tend to make this disclaimer, which is that having made all of these points, I fully recognize that policy recommendations are as easy to make as they are difficult to implement. So really the crux of my remarks, and what I will reiterate, is that first we need to create the conditions that makes these recommendations that may look great on paper feasible and actionable in reality. And for this, through my remarks, I have identified 4 ways, right? I have talked about the expansion and clarification of language and definitions that effectively govern the field of nuclear security. I've also talked about a greater effort at de-siloizing the field of nuclear security. I have referred to a diversification of knowledge production and realistically accepting that we tend to look to a certain set of, shall I say, elite countries to emulate, even as we lay emphasis on the global south. And of course, we will need to consider the political environment in which such will can be fostered. I will close here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Excellent points. I would like to take upon the statement that you made about the political will. And it's the question to everyone, the members, the distinguished members of our panel. We see there was, and there is still, a political will to clearly define the red line when it comes to use of technical nuclear weapons. But when it comes to creating conditions intentionally by Russians with respect to Ukrainian nuclear power stations and facilities, such as nuclear waste facility, for example, storage, and others, we see a complete silence, as if this issue doesn't exist, as if those risks haven't been actually elevated on a daily basis when it comes to Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant in particular. Moreover, there is just completely missing in the discussion wherever we go and talk to representatives of power north or power south with respect to Russians targeting our energy infrastructure. Part of it is actually the one that provides safety and security of nuclear units. Because when you don't have operational, for example, substation that provides the delivery of the electricity that is produced at the nuclear unit to the grid, that creates a scenario for a major catastrophe, such as, for example, as we look at 3 Mile Island. This is exactly what happened. And we already have seen such attempts from the Russian side to implement exactly the same scenarios with respect to not just Zaporizhzhya nuclear power plant, but all other nuclear power plants. And as you correctly mentioned, Dr. Kasapoglu, the radiation doesn't know any border. And really, it depends on where the wind will blow, which countries will be affected. Not necessarily, by the way, European continent. It can go all the way up to Turkey, for example. So why there is absence of appreciation of the risks associated with that? Why the clear red line is not drawn and communicated? And I really want to use this opportunity to thank all countries, including India, for clearly communicated to Russians that the use of technical nuclear weapon is the red line. But can we expect that this red line will be also added by another point, that any attempts of creating a nuclear disaster in Ukraine is also a red line, especially in light of what happened to Kakhovka Dam? Everyone was telling to us, Russians won't blow it, they will not touch it, it's not in their interest, but they did it. And it took the world, not hours, not even days, sometimes we haven't even heard any comments that it's the Russians who did that, and it was intentional. So while we hear comments that, oh, well, they will not create conditions for a major disaster, nuclear disaster in Ukraine, I don't buy it. I mean, look at Kakhovka. We all have to learn this lesson. So what should be done to extend the red line and extend it and add the civil nuclear facilities to the list? Can each of you please comment on that?
Well, should you expect that kind of red line? You should. Realistically, right now, you can't. I'm going to be very straightforward here. Running the right cause in international affairs and getting the right result are two different things. There are ways to move international community. There are ways to move decision makers, policy makers, okay? And Ukraine did one thing really well. Ukraine proved that it doesn't have a typical post-Soviet military. It has what we call well-trained, well-disciplined combat formations to hold the line. But I'm going to be very honest as a friend of Ukraine. When it comes to shaping international information space, it is still the baby steps here. In order to make it a red line, you have to have a headliner in the Washington Post, okay? Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. You should have you are looking at the restaurant, the service and the tables, but everything is cooked in the kitchen. This is how it works in the strategic community of the transatlantic world. That kitchen is the think tanks, research institutes, all the shapers of the policy, not the executors of policy. The Ukrainian representation in that strategic community is misdesigned from the outset, because it was designed as voicing the Ukrainian. By the way, propaganda is not a bad thing. Every state does propaganda. Policy is propaganda. But it was designed to voice the Ukrainian requirements, not set the agenda. As long as you do not set the agenda, you are just a voice in a discussion, and you are as big as your capacity. And with the skin of your teeth, I understand that you are trying to hold the line, and very heroically, your military is doing that. But in order to set that red line, and I think that definitely you should set that red line, not only for yourself, for international security, for the regional security, definitely. And it is, by the way, it is creating a very dangerous precedent, because this is the first time. And in military affairs, first time is really hard, but second time is really easy. Once it is done, they're going to follow suit. In order to set that red line, this conference should be held in London, DC, in these kind of capitals, and the shapers of policy should be voicing that. This is how policy is made in Western capitals. This is how policy is made in the Euro-Atlantic strategic community. I'm coming from those circles. I know how it works. I know how it moves. It doesn't, in a notorious fashion, but realistically, it means little if you are right. What would make a difference is if you know how to move the pieces. The way to move the pieces is to have that as a headliner in the Washington Post, so that congressional staffers read that, okay? So that everybody reads that as an objective security assessment. Objective security assessments translate into policy, not frustrations, even though they are right and righteous frustrations. This is my very objective, and as a friend of Ukraine, very, realistic and feasible answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your honest and friendly recommendations. Any other thoughts on how to push this issue from our distinguished guests? Do you have any thoughts to share with us?
Very important issue is that it is first time in the history of the world that nuclear plant is occupied by militants. So there is no international framework how to cope with this. And in the times of Obama, there was a nuclear summit, which are not the case now. So the Biden administration, for example, could, on its own initiative, to make this summit renewed and to propose nuclear states like France, Great Britain, and other nuclear states to adopt international framework to the consequences of today's actions, and to make some international framework and the laws how the nuclear facilities could be protected by the club of these nuclear countries. Thanks.
Thank you, Victoria. I'll keep this short. I am in agreement with the two speakers. What I heard was a setting of the red line. My pushback against this, I'm just playing the devil's advocate, I don't agree with, obviously, the use of TAC nukes, is even if we set the red line, we cannot confidently 100% say that the red line will not be crossed, because we can't predict the enemy's intent. And these are conversations we have in South Asia as well, because Pakistan has tactical nuclear weapons. And really the greatest utility, according to me, in my analytical assessment, is that the greatest utility of a nuclear weapon is in its non-use. So we can come to a conversation about assessments of potential nuclear use, but to create elite consensus against holding this red line, I would say everyone will call out any sort of challenging of the nuclear taboo. But I don't know to what extent they are going to generate the options necessary to hold that red line.
Thank you. Do we have our guest from Brazil? Can we hear his perspective on this question?
Thank you. So I just to complement of what has been said, I think Ukraine has and had, particularly in the West, has been incredibly effective at projecting its narratives, at making this case relatable, being present in the public discourse, being very highly effective through diplomatic means. I think now that the country is much more present in the global south as well, it will be sort of a different set of challenge, considering the different realities, particularly the fact that countries struggle with so many domestic challenges, which makes them less capable of, let's say, taking diplomatic measures that have an immediate economic cost. However, as I can say here from the perspective of Brazil, the country, we've just been able to welcome the new Ukrainian ambassador after there was no ambassador for 2 years. And all these problems that we've just discussed here on the panel, there's been very little visible in the Brazilian media about Ukraine's perspective. A colleague here just mentioned the Washington Post. I mean, the same dynamic is true across the world. And I think that a strong diplomatic strategy, which can't be just a reproduction of the strategy in the West, but needs to be adjusted to realities in each country across the global South, I think is bound to have a significant impact. And I think conferences like this one actually are sort of a part of that strategy of bringing more people together, of being able to make Ukraine's experience and the cases that we were describing here more relatable, so that participants can go back to their respective communities, share what they've learned. I think promoting these people-to-people contacts is just absolutely crucial among specialists, because after all, these are connections which traditionally have existed only in the most minimal fashion. I think we're just at the beginning now to articulate a broader dialogue, an institutionalized dialogue between institutions in the global South, experts in the global South, and their Ukrainian counterparts. So I think I'm actually slightly more optimistic. I think that these things take some time, but now that I think there's a genuine effort and a mutual interest to connect experts and to learn more about each other, I think that that these efforts can also then produce tangible outcomes.
Thank you very much. Olga, your comments on this subject?
Сьогодні прозвучало.
Well, first of all, today we had so many wise, important and appropriate things declared. And quite possibly, up until today, we were a little bit too emotional, and we were discussing emotions more than actions. But today, 1 year since, I do recollect November 23rd, and that was the day when the territory of Ukraine was subject to massive missile attack, and almost all distribution stations in our electricity grid were destroyed, thus cutting short our electricity transfer capacity. And this was the day when many of us physically realized what it means and how we should act. Up until that day, we were ignorant about possible response. And I do remember all of us praying for the dispatchers working their shift in nuclear power plants would be skillful and prudent enough to shut the reactors down, to prevent them from overheating and exploding. I also remember the day when the nuclear waste site was captured and the Russians have demolished electricity grid which was servicing this site. And that was clear that this is also one of the emergency situations which was not covered in any of our security protocols. Nobody was prepared. Third situation, the Kakhovka Dam destruction, and respectively the water reservoirs draining, putting at risk the cooling system of the nuclear power plant at risk. Now again, speaking of Zaporizhzhya, there will be a hot halt in one of the reactors because the occupational forces have done nothing to prevent the electricity supply disaster in Energodar. So, mentioning red lines, we can set the appropriate agenda with a very small font, big size sheets with a number of red lines listed there. And Ukrainian experts can make up such lists because we have the experience, the lessons, and the products to describe. So, when it comes to setting up the red lines, indeed, they should be our initiatives. We should be drafting and submitting the respective resolutions to the United Nations because this is taking place in Ukraine. There are no protocols drafted so far, and we have to be drafting that. If we need some Ukrainian legislation to be drafted first, we definitely will do so, because now we have coped with our emotions. Now we come to the next stage. We have to cope with these challenges. And to do so, we also have to make sure that international regulations are also capable of coping with such challenges. And when it comes to nuclear safety and security and managing nuclear fuel, that also has to be amended, because this is also a gap in international law. But also there is another important element which has not been mentioned so far. It's an excellent thing to have this treaty between India and Pakistan regarding nuclear sites. Another wonderful thing being that the nuclear terrorism now is recognized, but still it has to be defined on paper. Also, when it comes to red lines, not only red line definition should be put on paper, but also accountability, responsibility and liabilities, as well as the mechanism which should be deployed to hold the perpetrators liable, clearly stating that any individual or party which is capturing or seizing any kind of nuclear site should be held liable, with at least with a life sentence in line with international law. And if we have such written on paper and declared and ratified by other countries, not a single serviceman, not a single mercenary, not a single invader will be bold enough to cross that red line, putting one's foot into the secured area of such nuclear site. But to make sure this happens, we all have to sit together, take a blank sheet of paper, a pen, and write the new rules, which could and should be ratified by everybody, starting with the global West and down to the global South, putting their signature at the bottom of that sheet, including India, Pakistan, Turkey, and everybody else, including those countries where Rosatom at the moment is building new nuclear power stations, expecting that you will become dependent on their fuel. But you have to remember about your future freedom, your future peace, your future independence from vicious partners, and possibility to refer to reliable partners. Now, when we are discussing policies, then the regional politicians should be thinking how to protect their countries and their regions from future risks, and move side by side with Ukraine to identifying the new definition, vision, and interpretation of the red lines. So we do appreciate your contributions, and we do appreciate that you are keeping up in your pace with Ukraine, and you're disregarding the threat of having some individual countries not being willing to put their signatures, but will definitely make up those laws. Thank you.
Distinguished panelists, have any other thoughts to share, the conclusions to make? Please go ahead, because I think Olga has already summed up a lot of things, and there is a to-do list after our discussions. But first of all, yes, if you have any closing remarks, please share with us.
As we are just repeating the word red lines and red lines and red lines, let us remember 10 years ago in Syria, the Obama administration had a red line about the chemical weapons use, right? And the red line wasn't based on if you use chemical weapons, I'm going to go to Lavrov and cut a deal about that. The red line was if you use chemical weapons, we're going to take military action. And the Syrian regime did use chemical weapons, right? And what did the Obama administration do? They cut a deal. They cut a deal with the Lavrov Foreign Office mediating that. It was the same team that created and designed the JCPOA, aka the nuclear deal with Iran. So right now I'm going to say a very, very blunt, straightforward, objective fact here. I'm with Ukrainians, all of you have relatives and like beloved ones fighting this war. If I tell you in a hypothetical way, is Iran killing Ukrainian civilians by systematically providing loitering munitions to the Russian military? The plain answer to that is yes, yes, Iran is killing Ukrainian civilians. But let me tell you, my friends, You cannot pronounce that sentence in the bulk of think tanks in continental Europe and some think tanks in Washington, D.C., okay? Because that word would alienate Iran, the beloved Iran. That word would, you know, like jeopardize the nuclear arrangements with Iran. The moment that first Iranian Shahid 136 raided Ukrainian cities, it was legal the time for snapback sanctions. And all the remaining parties of the JCPOA walking away from JCPOA. But right now in Washington, there is a scandal. The intellectual backers of the nuclear deal exchange emails with Revolutionary Guards. During the time of the nuclear deal participations, when they were invited to panels in Israel, they asked the Iranian Foreign Office, should I join, should I not join? Okay? There were guys who sent their draft articles to be vetted by the Iranian Foreign Office, and those guys designed the nuclear deal. Those guys set the red lines in Syria. Do not expect any red lines, firm red lines from that line of thought. Okay? This is gone by the wind. Paradigmally, this line of thought cannot draw and back any red lines. Iran is killing Ukrainian civilians. Okay? And again, I'm saying, in certain European think tanks and in certain Washington circles, you cannot even voice that plain fact that Iran is systematically killing Ukrainian civilians. Okay? Do not expect any red lines, any firm red lines from that line of thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Any closing remarks?
Yes, I actually wanted to thank Olga for the dignity of your comments. And although you apologized for emotions, I think emotions have a critical place in this conversation. I, of course, did. I spoke to the subject I was invited to speak to, but I must acknowledge that this was a difficult set of remarks to think on, because the intellectualism of our ivory towers have no place in a country and among a people at war. So thank you for listening to our comments, even if you with them. Happy to have a conversation.
Thank you. Sana?
Yes, it was a very fruitful conversation, discussion. So what we should understand that using nuclear power, peaceful nuclear power, should be like using nuclear weapon. And EU and NATO countries should understand that we are approximately near the catastrophe in the Europe, and their reactions should be now, when the Zaporizhzhya NPP is not blown up, but it will be no use of all these worries when it will come up. So everybody saw how the Kakhovka Dam was blown up, and the only question is when the international community will be proactive to act and to make it will not happen. So clear response in the package, in the 12th package, is needed now. Thanks.
Thank you. And the final thoughts from our distinguished guest from Brazil, please.
Thank you very much. It's been a privilege to be a part of this conversation, and I hope this can be a starting point of a broader dialogue. As I said, I think that these issues continue, not to have the visibility in countries like Brazil that they deserve. So I think initiatives like these are absolutely fundamental to draw in a larger amount of experts, of policymakers, of commentators, to make sure that these things are present in the public discourse, and also have an impact as countries like Brazil devise their foreign policy and articulate their strategy vis-a-vis the current conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us today. And on this note, I would like to conclude by saying that we all need to recognize that Ukraine is heading towards one of the most difficult winters in our modern history. We are unfortunately worse off when we compare our readiness for the winter, if we compare last year and this year. We understand that Russians will continue targeting our critical infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, and those parts that provide safety and security of our nuclear power plants. And I think it's a right time, and it's a hard time for the world to recognize those risks that we've discussed today. And again, I would like to reiterate, radiation doesn't know any borders. So preemptive measures have to be taken in order to avoid major catastrophes. So I really hope that the discussions we've had today will be continued and the message will be sent to your country's politicians, decision makers, to finally wake up and stop using, for example, IAEA, International Atomic Agency, as an excuse to close the eyes towards the real issues that we are dealing with respect to Russian nuclear terrorism. Thank you very much for being with us, and I hope we will have more discussion during the lunchtime. Thank you.